Greetings. Today I'd like to do a quick little tutorial on adding bones to an existing figure. This is typically useful for things like navel piercings, earrings, anything of the like, where they usually don't have multiple segments to them, and when they do have morphs, the problem with the morphs is they tend to make the shapes deform the more you apply the morph. As you can see here, it's not really what you want when you're trying to adjust the navel piercing to follow the contour of an abdomen when the figure is bent or twisted, etc. So we're going to convert this from a prop into a segmented figure. And the first thing to do to make that happen is we need to, from the scene view, we have the figure selected, click the context menu, go down to edit, go down to rigging, and choose convert prop to figure. And you want that default triax and hit accept. And it stuck this figure underscore in the front of the name. We're going to get rid of that. And I'll also put in an extra space here. And we can see that in the conversion, DAZ gave us one bone for the figure, called it hip because that's the default. And we still have those same morphs, and they still cause the thing to kind of explode as you shift the morph, which we don't want. And so the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to get rid of these morphs that don't actually work. And so if you right click while you're in the parameters tab and you do edit mode, we can now right click on each of the morphs and go to delete selected property, delete selected property, delete selected property, delete selected property. And now we're back to sort of the main stuff because we got rid of all the morphs, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to turn off edit mode. So now we're back to normal edit mode. Then the next thing I'm going to do, because I do this with pretty much all props, is I'm going to say convert to sub D, because almost invariably they're of very low poly counts, and then bump the sub D up to 2. And at this point, we have the prop converted to a weight mapped figure. We've got sub D applied, and we've cleaned up, gotten rid of the morphs that don't really work anyway. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say file, save as, support asset, figure prop. And this will let us come back in the event we mess anything up. So I'm going to say, I'm going to overwrite 2 roses. Yes, overwrite. And it's now asking about how we want to save it. And so for vendor name, you should use your own vendor name. Don't try to use the vendor name of the original creator of the product, because you don't want to, it's considered bad form to stick stuff in other people's vendor hierarchies. Product name, I'm going to I've created this product name where I've stuck other navel piercings I've fixed, and then item name, it pulled forward. And then content type, I'm going to say prop waist. And the rest of this we can leave as is and say accept. And so that caused Studio to save it. So now we need to get started on preparing this figure for having the bones. And to do, the first thing we have to do is work in the geometry editor, which is actually what I've currently got selected up here. You can also get to that from Tools, Geometry, and you'll see that at the moment this figure has one face group, which is called abdomen, And we're going to actually rename that to navel piercing. And that's going to be the top part of the navel piercing, and this first ring we're going to leave as not bending. Instead, let that be part of the base piercing. For this particular navel piercing, I was thinking we would make it into 2 additional segments. First segment will be this first flower in its base, these 2 rings, and then actually the bottom ring below it, so it mimics the same behavior as how we were going to leave this ring with the base piercing itself. And so we're in the geometry editor. I'm going to set mode to marquee, which is actually currently where I have it, and I'm going to drag select over these. And then to get the rest of the 2 rings, I'm going to do geometry selection, select connected, and now we can see they're all highlighted. And we do right click, geometry assignment, create face group. And that face group we're going to call flower top, accept. And now we want to do a similar thing for the bottom bit. So I'm going to say clear selection, and I'm going to drag select in marquee view. And I'm going to say geometry selection, select connected, and geometry create face group, flower bottom, accept, and clear. So at this point we have face group, which is the top. You can see it kind of highlighted a little bit reddish. The top flower and its rings, and then the bottom flower and its rings. Now the next step is that we need to actually add bones in with the joint editor. And I'm going to start by highlighting the hip bone, going to Tools Settings, and going to Joint Editor. We can see we've got this top joint is set up where this is the center, this is the end of it, and if we actually go into parameters and on the hip and we say rotate, you can see it rotates around that center point, and Y they go, and Z it goes, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to add a new, well actually the first thing I want to do is, I don't like the name hip, it doesn't seem appropriate for a thing like this, so I'm going to say edit, rename node, and we're going to call this navel piercing, Control C, Control V, accept. And it updated. And so the next thing is to add our next bone. And this is one of those things where it's a little hard to notice because it's hidden away in the corner menu again. So with that hip bone now called navel piercing selected, I'm going to say create child bone. And we will call this flower top. Hit tab and it filled in the name, the label for us as well. And we need to change the rotation order, and we need that YXZ, which you'll notice is the same as what's being used already for the root bone. And so I'll say accept. And what it's done now is it's created this new bone. It's up here because what it did is it actually set it to match the end of the prior bone. And we're going to bring it down to line up with the little metal bit here, and then this 11.58, move it forward, we come in here in the front, we zoom in a little, we can see we need to come down just a tad bit more. So we're at 11.9 or 110.9. And we look pretty good on this side as well. And so I'm going to make the Z position for the N be the same, 11.58. And then we bring the Y down. And again, we don't necessarily have to have it line up specifically because what's actually going to move is going to be based on the weight maps that we do. But because it will make the next bone start where this one ends, if we bring this down, so it's in about the right place for where we'll want the next bone to start. I think actually maybe we want 5.0. Yeah. So we've got this bone, and now if we go and we say rotate, you'll notice that while the bone is moving, none of the geometry is actually moving. That's because we haven't yet attached it. And so what we're going to do is, if we've got this flower top bone still selected, we're going to say change the selection group, and we're going to pick our flower top, that region that we previously created. And that's important because now if we come down here and we select the node weight map brush, we can, as a shortcut, so if I click on X, Y, or Z here, for example, you'll see that nothing is lighting up. But if I go and I say weight editing and I say fill bone by bone selection group, and then I click on these again, we can see that now the bits that we want to move with this bone are now all dark red, which means that they're 100% fill or weight map. If we go to parameters again and now we do X and we see it rotates. And if we do Z, it comes toward, well, let me change the camera angle. And if we do Y, and it won't, actually it does move when we do the X as well. So in the event that, like if we do Z a lot, well, that we're in pretty good position. If we do X, you can see that maybe now it needs to come forward just a tiny bit. So we could say like 0.1. That moves it forward a little bit. And we could then do minus 0.1 or whatever and move it down a little bit. So you can play with them if it starts drifting away when you start pivoting. But I'm going to control those back out. And again, the main thing here is that as we rotate, the shape of what we're moving stays the same, unlike when we had those morphs, where as we moved it, it kind of exploded in size, which is not what we want. So we've got one bone done and the appropriate geometry attached, and so now we're going to do the other ones. So we currently have this flower top selected. We're going to go back and do basically the same thing. Go and we select the joint editor, and we're going to say create child bone. This one will be flower bottom. Hit tab. Again, we want YXZ for the rotation order. Hit accept. And as I said, because we had set the end bone on the prior, the end point on the prior bone, our start point is basically correct here. So all we need to do is bring down the end point. And again, this isn't really terribly important where we end it because it's going to be the weight map that controls what actually gets moved, and we don't have any further bones to add, so getting it to be in the right place for the next bone doesn't matter. And actually, one thing I forgot about is, although in this case it should end up still being zeros. Yep. Say that we had this bone and the endpoint was going to be off to the side. We need the orientation here to match. And like, you could play games with trying to manually figure out how far. Now in this case it's easy because the only thing we moved was X. But say you had X and Y and so forth. Well, you can do align node, and Studio figures out for you what the alignment correction is from the center point to the end node. Now I'm going to back these changes out because that was for demonstration purposes only. And the same thing technically would apply for this bone, but again, because it's actually pointing straight down, even when you do a line, it stays at 0. So it didn't affect us here, but if you were working on a figure that, for example, say maybe it's got different dangly bits that come out at angles in their natural shape, you would want to make sure that you fix the orientation using that align option for each of those bones. And so again here, I'm going to say selection group. I'm going to pick that second face group that we created. And then I'm going to go to joint editor or tool selection. I'm going to select the weight map tool. And then I'm going to again say weight editing fill by bone selection group. And now when I highlight these, we can see that the bottom is properly shown up red. And if I go to parameters and I go X rotate, we can see that the bottom moves. If I zoom out a little bit, and if I go to here, we can see that cascading joints work. So I can go X, then down here I can say Y, and or maybe I did some Z, and the joints are doing what we expect, and we don't have any of the geometry exploding on us like with when we had the morphs. And so I controlled Z back, so we're back at the zeros. And so now basically we're done. The thing to do is to go back. If you wanted to make any changes to what materials are set, you could do so now. But I'm going to basically sort of center the window on here so that the snapshot that Studio makes for the icon is correct. And I'm going to go and I'm going to again say File, Save As, Support Asset, Figure Prop, overwrite our two roses. Because we set this before, these settings are all being remembered. So I can say Accept, and it just resaved the figure. So I can say delete, and as an example, if I load in an instance of a G2F, and we'll go parameters, and we will say actor, upper body, waist, and dial in the navel. And go back to the geometry editor, and well, helps to set the mode back to drag selection. So bing, 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 and we will grow selection, and we'll say geometry assignment, create rigid follow node. I did a previous video on this. And we will call this navel follower. And that has given us now this sort of virtual node that will follow the figure. And if we go to content library and we load in our 2 roses that we've created, and I've got here parent items in place selected, and I'm going to reparent this to the navel follower. And then let's sort of get this aligned a bit. And what we probably would have is a little bit of a bend like this. Move it up just a tad more. Well, -11, nope, 10.75. So maybe too much. How about 9? There. And as you can see, with the piercing sort of aligned for the navel, the bottom bit is already going into the abdomen, which we don't want. But before we start correcting that, I'm going to throw in a few more twists and turns here, right? So actually pose control, torso. So we will say bend back and some side to side and some twist, which is probably not how you would ever actually bend a figure for a real pose, but it demonstrates what's going on here. So if we look, we can see that because of that navel follower, the navel piercing mostly stayed in the right place, although it looks like we could do with a tiny bit of Y rotation to correct it, and maybe just a tiny bit of X. 0.1, yeah. And so now we can expand. We'll go to our top flower and rotate it down so it's hanging down. And we could actually do a little bit like that. And then for the bottom bit, we're gonna use X to bend it back out. And are we still pointing down? Looks like we're pretty good for down, but if we wanted to, we could swing it a little bit one way or the other. And so the net effect here is that we have a piercing which we can shape to however the figure is bent so that it looks like it is aligned with the abdomen of the figure and following gravity. And so that's the end of this tutorial. I hope it was helpful, and if you have any questions, please let me know. Cheers.